The mist clung to the hollows like a shroud, wrapping the jagged peaks of the Appalachians in a perpetual grey haze that swallowed sound and light alike. Down in Red Hollow, where the Whitaker clan had scratched out a living for generations, folks didn't talk much about the outside world. They kept to their own, bound by blood thicker than the mud that caked their boots after a rain. Eliza Whittaker was just 13 when it happened, a slip of a girl with hair like corn silk and eyes that seemed to hold the shadows of the mountains themselves. She wasn't much for words, but there was a quiet fire in her, the kind that made the old-timers nod and say she carried the old ways in her veins. It started on a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the leaves rustled like whispers from the grave. Eliza had wandered off the dirt path behind the family cabin, chasing what she later swore was the faint cry of a lost child echoing through the pines. Her pa, Harlan Whitaker, a man whose face bore the same sharp angles as his father's and his grandfather's before him, didn't raise the alarm right away. "She'll turn up," he'd mutter, spitting tobacco juice into the underbrush, his voice rough as splintered oak. But as the sun dipped low and the fog rolled in thicker, even he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. By morning, she was gone, vanished into the woods that had claimed so many before her. The search was half-hearted at best. The sheriff from the nearest town poked around for a day or two, shining his flashlight into crevices where roots twisted like veins under the earth. Neighbors murmured about bears or bootleggers, but deep down, they knew better. The Whitakers were different, always had been. Marriages stayed in the family, cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, a tangled web spun to keep outsiders away and the blood pure. Whispers of deformities hidden in back rooms, of babies born with eyes too wide or limbs too frail, floated like ghosts through the hollow. No one dared say it aloud, but everyone wondered if Eliza had been pulled into that same darkness. A full year crawled by, marked by seasons that blurred into one endless gloom. The cabin sagged a little more under the weight of unspoken grief, and Harlan took to sitting on the porch with a shotgun across his lap, staring into the trees as if daring them to give back what they'd taken. Then, one twilight just as the first snowflakes dusted the ground, a figure emerged from the mist at the edge of the woods. It was Eliza, or what was left of her, gaunt, her dress torn and stained, her belly swollen with life that shouldn't be. She collapsed at the cabin door, her lips cracked and blue, murmuring words that sent a shiver through the air. The woods, they remember. The blood, it calls. No one asked where she'd been, not at first. But as she lay there, feverish and clutching her unborn child, the questions gnawed like roots burrowing deep. What had happened in those lost months? Who or what had fathered the life inside her? And why did her eyes, once bright, now reflect something ancient and unbroken, a mystery woven into the very fabric of the mountains? The hollow held its breath, waiting for the truth to uncoil like a serpent from the shadows. The fog in Red Hollow never truly lifted, it only thinned enough to let a sickly grey light seep through the pines and settle over the scattered cabins like a damp wool blanket. Down at the end of a washed-out wagon track, where the creek ran black with tannin and the mountains pressed so close you could feel their weight on your chest, stood the Whitaker place, 3 rooms of warped clapboard, a leaning chimney, and a roof patched so many times it looked quilted. The yard was nothing but red clay and chickweed, a rusted bedsprings, and the bones of old cars that had died there decades earlier. Nothing ever left Red Hollow, not even the junk. Inside that house lived what was left of the Whitaker bloodline, Harlan, his sister-wife Laureen, their grown boys who shared the same narrow skull and pale eyes, and Eliza, the youngest, the last daughter born before the miscarriages outnumbered the live births. She was small for 13, all elbows and knees, with hair the color of late September corn and a way of moving that made her seem half wild, as though the woods had already started claiming her long before that final evening. On the day she vanished, the air smelled of wood smoke and distant rain. Eliza had been sent, as she was most afternoons, to gather kindling along the ridge trail that skirted the back of the property. It was a chore she knew by heart. The path was barely wider than a deer run, hemmed in by laurel thickets so dense the sunlight came down in thin green blades. Folks in the hollow said those thickets whispered if you listened too long, but Eliza had always listened anyway. She carried a burlap sack over one shoulder and moved with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged to the mountain and creek more than she ever belonged to the cabin. Harlan watched her go from the porch, the way he always did, squinting against the weak light, chewing the inside of his cheek. He didn't call after her, didn't tell her to stay close. In Red Hollow you learned early that calling after someone only made the woods hungrier. The screen door slapped shut behind him as he went back inside, and the fog folded over the trail like a closing mouth. By supper she hadn't returned. By full dark the family sat in silence around the oil lamp, listening to the wind rattle the loose tin on the roof. No one spoke the word missing. Not yet. In the Whitaker house some things were understood without saying. The mountain took what it wanted, and sometimes it gave back something worse. Word traveled slow in Red Hollow, carried on foot or by the rare truck that rattled down the switchback once a week for mail and chewing tobacco. Yet within days of Eliza's empty place at the table, every porch from Piney Branch to Wolf Pen had the same hushed conversation. Folks didn't speak the name Whitaker name loud, they let it drop like a stone into still water and watched the ripples. They spoke instead of the old stories, the ones mothers used to hush crying babies. How the first Whitakers rolled into these mountains with nothing but a Bible, a rifle, and a stubborn refusal to mix their blood with valley people. How cousins married cousins until the family tree twisted back on itself like a grapevine choked by its own weight. How children were born with the same pale eyes set too far apart, the same soft bones that snapped in a hard winter, the same silent way of staring that made strangers cross the road. Some babies never drew breath at all, others lived long enough to learn the family habit of keeping secrets the way other folks kept hogs. Down at the Crossroads store, old men rocked on nail kegs and traded fragments the way boys traded marbles. They remembered Harlan's own mother, a girl of 14 brought to the altar by her uncle because the Lord told him the blood must stay strong. They remembered the stillborns buried without names behind the cabin, little mounds no bigger than possum graves. They remembered the night Laureen, Harlan's sister and wife, screamed for 3 hours straight giving birth to a boy with a mouth that opened sideways. The midwife left before dawn and never came back up the hollow again. Now Eliza was gone, and the silence from the Whitaker place felt heavier than any scream. No tears on the porch, no pleas nailed to trees, no reward offered. Just Harlan splitting wood with the same steady rhythm, the axe falling again and again as if rhythm alone could keep the dark at bay. That unnatural calm fed the whispers more than any outburst ever could. People began to say the girl hadn't run off or fallen down a sinkhole. They said the family had taken her deeper, past the Laurel Hells where the trail ended, to some place only Whitakers knew. A place where the old rights still held, where a girl on the cusp of womanhood could be hidden until the blood had done its work. The mountain, they murmured, had always been hungry for the purest strain. And the Whitakers had always been willing to feed it. Winter came early that year, the kind that sank its teeth into the ridge and refused to let go. Snow filled the footprints no one had bothered to follow, and turned the creek to hammered pewter. The search parties, 3 men from the church and a deputy who hated the cold, gave up before Thanksgiving. They told themselves a body would surface when the thaw came, or the bears would scatter what was left. Either way, it was out of their hands. But the mountain would not stay quiet. At first it was only the hunters who noticed. Men coming down off the high boards spoke of lights moving between the spruce where no cabin stood, pale blue orbs that drifted just above the ground and vanished when you blinked. They said the lights kept perfect pace with a man for a mile or more, then winked out like someone snuffing a candle. Dogs refused to follow the glow, tucking tail and whining until their masters turned back. Then came the crying. It started as a thin wail riding the wind after midnight, too high for a woman, too broken for a child. Folks in the lower hollows swore they heard it even with windows shut and quilts pulled over their heads. Some claimed it sounded like a name, Eliza, Eliza, stretched thin and torn. Others said it was only a panther screaming, though no panther had been seen in those parts since the chestnut trees died. Mothers began bringing their children inside before full dark, and the men took to carrying loaded rifles even to the outhouse. Up nearer the Whitaker place the sounds were worse. Harlan's boys claimed they heard scratching under the floorboards at night, slow and deliberate, like fingernails testing for weak planks. Laureen took to sleeping with the Bible open on her chest, pages fluttering though there was no draft. Once, just after the new year, a neighbor passing on the trail saw every window of the cabin glowing soft green from within, yet no lamp burned and the chimney stood cold. When he worked up the nerve to knock, the glow vanished and Harlan answered the door with eyes so wide the whites showed all around. The mountain kept its own calendar. Snow melted and refroze, icicles grew long as scythes, and still the lights danced and the crying drifted down the ravines. People began to understand that whatever had taken Eliza was not finished. It was waiting. It was watching. The anniversary of her disappearance fell on a night so cold the stars looked brittle. Snow lay in uneven drifts across the hollow, glowing faintly under a few hours before dawn. No one in Red Hollow slept well anymore. The crying had grown louder as winter tightened its grip, threading itself into every dream. Then, just when the ridge should have been blackest, a shape moved at the edge of the trees. It came slow, stumbling over frozen ruts, dragging something that might once have been a burlap sack but now hung in tatters from one thin shoulder. At first the dogs only growled low, uncertain whether to bark at ghost or flesh. Then one let out a single terrified yelp and bolted under the porch. The figure kept coming, boots long gone, feet wrapped in rags crusted with ice and old blood. Moonlight caught the swollen curve beneath the shredded dress and turned it silver, obscene, impossible. When she reached the porch steps she folded like a marionette with its strings cut. Harlan was already there. He must have been sitting in the dark again, shotgun across his knees, because the door opened before she touched the wood. No one heard him speak, but his shadow stretched long and thin over the snow as he stared down at what the mountain had returned. Eliza's face was barely recognizable. Cheekbones sharp enough to cut paper, lips split and black with cold, eyes sunk so deep they seemed to reflect the sky itself. Her hair, once the color of summer straw, hung in matted ropes stiff with filth and pine needles. Yet it was still her, the same small scar through the left eyebrow from when she'd fallen against the stove at 6, the same way she held her elbows close to her sides when she was frightened. Only now the fear had been burned out of her and replaced with something older, something that watched from behind those hollow eyes without blinking. She tried to speak. The sound that came out was more animal than girl, a cracked whisper that tasted of iron and grave dirt. Harlan knelt, slow as a man lowering himself into cold water, and put one rough hand against the impossible swell of her belly. Whatever he felt beneath the threadbare cloth made the shotgun clatter forgotten to the floorboards. Inside the cabin, Laureen began a high, keening note that rose and fell like a hymn played backward. Eliza lifted her head then, just enough for the moonlight to find her mouth. When she finally managed words, they came out flat and ancient, as though the mountain itself had borrowed her tongue. "The blood kept me warm," she said. "It's almost time." Morning broke grey and reluctant, the kind of light that made every face look half dead. Word of Eliza's return spread faster than fever, carried on the breath of neighbors who crept close enough to peer through the frost-laced windows before scurrying away. By noon the yard was ringed with silent onlookers, men in feedstore caps and women clutching shawls to their throats, all staring at the girl laid out on a cornshuck mattress near the hearth. Someone had wrapped her in a quilt older than the house itself, the pattern faded to ghosts of indigo and blood red. Beneath it her belly rose like a pale moon, taut and veined with blue, moving in slow, deliberate waves no 13-year-old frame was meant to contain. Every so often her whole body jerked as though something inside tested the walls of its prison, and each kick met with a soft, involuntary moan that sounded too knowing for a child. But it was her face that rooted people to the spot. Hunger had carved it down to bone and shadow, yet the bones themselves were wrong, too delicate in some places, too heavy in others, as if two separate bloodlines had warred over the shaping of her skull and neither had fully won. The eyes, once the clear grey of creek stones, had darkened to the flat pewter found in century-old daguerreotypes of long-dead Whitakers hanging crooked on the cabin wall. When she turned her head, every portrait seemed to turn with her. Aunt Lottie from 1897, Cousin Obijah who drowned in 32, Great-Grandma Eula whose jaw had grown so pronounced the coffin-maker charged extra. All of them stared out with the same hollow, waiting expression now carved into Eliza's living face. Children pressed against their mother's skirts whispered that the baby must be drinking her from the inside, stealing color and youth to ready itself for the world. Old women crossed themselves though most had never set foot in a church, muttering about mirrors cracking the night Eliza came back, about milk souring in sealed jars, about dogs refusing to cross the threshold even when offered scraps of fatback. Harlan stood guard at the door, rifle in the crook of his arm, daring anyone to come closer. But even he couldn't hide the tremor in his hands when Eliza reached out in her fever and traced the air as though stroking invisible cheeks, faces only she could see. Each time she did, the swell beneath the quilt quickened, pressing outward in the exact shape of tiny fingers, tiny fists, tiny mouths hungry for a world that had already begun to dread their arrival. The quilt slipped lower as the fever rose, and the room grew thick with the smell of wood smoke, sour milk, and something coppery that clung to the back of the throat. Eliza's eyes, glassy and fixed on nothing, began to move beneath the lids as though she were watching a blind woman reading Braille written on the inside of her skull. When she spoke, it was in a voice too low and steady for the girl they remembered, a voice that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. She told them, between long silences broken only by the crackle of the hearth, about the cabin that had no map had ever dared mark. Past the laurel hells, past the place where the creek dropped into a sink and came out a mile away tasting of iron, there stood a second cabin older than the one they lived in now. Its logs were blackened by centuries of smoke, its roof sunk so low a grown man had to stoop to enter. Inside there was only one room, one iron bedstead, one Bible open to the book of Leviticus with certain verses underlined in blood-brown ink. That was where they had taken her the night she vanished. Not strangers, not spirits, but her own kin, Harlan's brothers, Laureen's sons, men whose faces she had known all her life and yet had never truly seen until the lantern light caught the hunger in them. They carried her blindfolded along a deer trail that twisted back on itself until direction lost all meaning, then down stone steps slick with moss into a narrow valley the sun touched only at high noon. There they kept her, feeding her on cornbread and sorrow, telling her it was time to keep the line unbroken the way their fathers and grandfathers had done when the outside world grew too loud and too curious. They spoke of purity the way other people spoke of salvation. They spoke of the land needing its tithe, of the mountain remembering every drop of blood ever spilled to keep it satisfied. They bathed her in water drawn from a spring that ran red at certain phases of the moon, dressed her in a gown sewn from pieces of wedding dresses worn by every Whitaker bride since 1813, and waited for her body to ripen the way you wait for fruit to swell before the first hard frost. And when her courses stopped, when the sickness came each morning and the life inside her began to quicken, they praised God in low, trembling voices and told her the child would be the strongest yet, closer to the first blood than any born in 100 years. They told her she had been chosen, that the woods had sung her name the day she was born, that running had never been possible. Eliza's fingers curled against the quilt now, nails broken and black with earth that would never wash out. Her lips moved slowly across her belly, tracing circles that matched the ones carved into the logs of that hidden cabin, circles within circles, a knot no knife could ever untie. The nights grew longer than the days, and the cabin became a lantern burning alone in a sea of black pines. Eliza no longer slept, she drifted on the edge of waking, eyes half open, pupils blown wide as if the dark had poured itself straight into her. When the pain came it rolled through her in slow, deliberate waves, but she never cried out. Instead she smiled a small, terrible smile and whispered to whatever moved beneath her skin. They began as flickers at the corner of vision, tall figures in antique dress standing just beyond the firelight, faces eaten away by time yet unmistakably Whitaker. A woman in a high-necked black with a veil of spiderweb lace. A man whose beard reached his belt and whose eyes were only empty sockets leaking slow tears of pitch. Children with too many joints in their fingers, pressing pale palms against the window glass until the panes bowed inward without breaking. They never spoke aloud. They didn't need to. Eliza heard them clear as church bells inside her skull. They told her the child was almost ready. They told her it had been waiting since the first cousin lay with cousin under these same rafters, gathering strength with every new knot tied in the family rope. Each generation had added another loop, another tightening gyro, until the blood ran so thick it remembered everything, every forced kiss, every stillborn sigh, every prayer muttered over a cradle that rocked itself. Now the circle was closing, and the baby, her baby, would be the lock snapping shut. Sometimes she woke with her hands cupped protectively over the drum-tight belly, crooning an old lullaby her mother had sung, only the words had changed. No longer about mockingbirds or diamond rings, but about roots drinking deep, about bones knitting together wrong and strong, about a cradle carved from the same tree that once held a hanged man. The tune was sweet and slow, the kind of beautiful, the kind that made Harlan cover his ears and rock in the corner like a child. In the final weeks the visions walked bolder. They sat on the foot of the bed, arranged themselves along the walls like guests at a birthing no one had invited yet everyone had been waiting for. They leaned close enough that Eliza could smell the earth on their funeral clothes, could see the moon shining clean through their ribcages. And always they stroked her hair, her cheeks, the impossible curve of her stomach, murmuring the same promise over and over. Soon, little mother. Soon the line will be perfect. Soon the mountain and blood will be one again. Eliza would nod, tears cutting clean trails through the dirt on her face, and answer in a voice that belonged to all of them at once. I know, she said. I've always known. A stranger arrived in Red Hollow on the last warm day before the leaves turned. He came in a dented green Ford with government plates and a notebook thick as a family Bible. Called himself a folklorist, though the bulge under his coat suggested something harder work. He asked questions the way a surgeon cuts, quick, clean, and without asking permission. Most doors slammed in his face. The Whitaker door never opened at all. So he stayed. He took a room above the Crossroads store, paid in crisp bills no one trusted, and spent his evenings on the porch with a lantern and a bottle of something that smelled like turpentine. Children watched from behind rain barrels while he sketched trees that weren't there and wrote words no one could read. At night he walked the ridges with a flashlight taped red, following game trails that ended in walls of laurel thick as prison bars. He always returning before dawn with mud to his knees and new pages filled. In the abandoned schoolhouse he found what the county had tried to forget, ledgers yellowed and mouse-chewed, birth and death records that stopped making sense after 1900. Names repeated like a stuck hymn, Elijah fathering Delilah who mothered another Elijah who died at 6 months and was replaced by another. Marriages listed between people sharing not just surnames but birthdates only years apart. Margin notes in different inks, different hands, all saying the same thing, taken to the upper place, returned with child, blood holds. He found photographs too, tucked inside a rusted biscuit tin behind loose bricks. Tintypes of brides no older than Eliza staring at the camera with the same hollow eyes now burning in her fevered face. One picture showed a circle of women in white, bellies swollen in perfect unison, standing before a cabin whose roofline matched the one Eliza had whispered about in her delirium. On the back, in faded pencil, 7 Sisters for the 7th Knot, 1893. The deepest find came on a morning when the creek ran high and red with clay. Under a flat stone near the sinkhole lay a journal bound in oilskin. The pages were soft as cloth, ink bled but legible. It began in 1824 with a preacher who claimed the mountain had spoken to him in his wife's voice and commanded him to keep the covenant pure. Every decade another hand took up the story, recipes for teas that stopped monthly bleeding, prayers to make a womb quicken faster, careful tallies of how many loops the blood had twisted before a child was born strong enough to hear the call. The last entry, dated only months before Eliza vanished, was written in Harlan's own shaky block letters. She is the vessel. The circle closes. Forgive us. The stranger closed the book, slid it inside his coat next to his heart, and started back down the trail while the first hard wind of autumn stripped the trees bare around him. The storm arrived without warning, the way punishment always does in the mountains. One minute the sky hung low and bruised, the next the heavens split open and rain came down in sheets thick enough to drown a man standing upright. Thunder rolled through the hollow like artillery, shaking jars from shelves and driving every dog for miles into whimpering beneath porches. Lightning clawed the ridge white again and again, turning the night into a series of frozen photographs, the sagging cabin, the bent pines, the swollen creek leaping its banks like something alive and furious. Inside, the air turned thick and animal. Eliza's water broke with the first thunderclap, a hot gush that soaked the cornshuck mattress and steamed in the cold. Laureen lit every lamp they owned, but the flames guttered and flattened as though the storm itself reached down the chimney to smother them. Harlan barred the door with his shoulder and would not let the stranger in, no matter how hard the wind hammered or how the man's voice cracked pleading through the cracks. Eliza lay on her back with her knees drawn up, dress rucked to her armpits, skin shining like wet marble. Every contraction bent her spine until the cords in her neck stood out like bridge cables. Between them she laughed, low, wet, knowing, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deeper than her chest. The women who had crept close to help backed away when they saw her eyes, Black from edge to edge, no whites at all, reflecting the lightning in perfect miniature. She began to speak the truth then, in a voice that rose and fell with the storm. She told how they had carried her up the hidden trail the night she vanished, how the men took turns holding her down while Harlan recited scripture over her belly. She told how the moon turned the color of a fresh bruise the first time the seed took, how the walls of the upper cabin sweated something darker than water while they waited for her body to accept the gift. She told how they sang to the child every night, old songs with no words, only breath and blood and promise. Each confession arrived on a bolt of lightning, each flash showing the room fuller than before, shapes crowding the corners, tall and thin, dressed in rotting wedding lace and burial suits, mouths sewn shut with black thread yet still managing to smile. They reached for her with hands that ended in too many fingers, stroking her hair, her thighs, the terrible drum of her stomach. The storm peaked. The cabin groaned like a living thing. And Eliza screamed once, not in pain, but welcome, as the circle finally snapped shut around them all. The rain stopped the instant the child slid free, as though the mountain itself had been holding its breath and finally let go. One heartbeat of perfect silence, then the newborn drew air and the sound it made was not a cry but a low, steady note, like a tuning fork struck against bone. Every lamp flared blue and steady, every shadow leapt to the walls and stayed there, pinned. Laureen's hands shook so hard she nearly dropped the infant before the cord was even cut. It was a boy, slick with birth blood and something darker that clung like pine pitch. His skin carried the faint grey cast of river stone, veins visible beneath in branching black rivers. The head was large, the skull-sloping brow too heavy for the delicate neck, yet he held it upright from the first moment, eyes already open and ancient. They were the same flat pewter as every dead Whitaker staring down from the photographs, but filmed with a second membrane that slid sideways when he blinked, like a lizard tasting air. His fingers were long, too many joints, nails curved and sharp, curled possessively around Laureen's thumb and would not let go. When he turned his face toward Eliza, she smiled the exhausted, radiant smile of a bride meeting her groom at the altar, and the baby smiled back with a mouth that contained too many teeth, small, translucent, needle-thin, already cutting through the gums in perfect rows. Harlan staggered back until the wall caught him. In the blue lamplight the child's chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm with the breathing of the figures crowded around the bed. Every inhalation lifted dozens of translucent ribs at once, as though the ancestors and infant shared the same lungs. A low humming rose, the same wordless song Eliza had sung in her fever, only now it came from every throat, living and dead, weaving itself into the rafters until the whole cabin vibrated like a bell. On the baby's left shoulder blade, livid against the grey skin, stood a birthmark shaped exactly like the endless knot carved into the hidden cabin's doorpost, circles within circles, red as fresh liver. When lightning flickered again, the mark glowed from within, pulsing in time with the tiny heart. The stranger, soaked and shaking on the porch, pressed his eye to a crack in the chinking and saw the mark flare, saw every shadowed face lean forward in perfect unison, saw Eliza reach out with arms already thinning to smoke and draw the child to her breast. The newborn latched without hesitation. The moment his mouth closed, every lamp went out at once, plunging the room into absolute dark. In that darkness the humming became laughter, soft, satisfied, eternal, and the smell of turned earth and copper flooded the room as though the floorboards had opened into graves. Outside, the storm began again, harder than before, but inside Red Hollow there was only the wet, steady sound of nursing and the knowledge, shared by every soul still breathing, that the covenant had finally borne its perfect fruit.